Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to How to Manage Your Scholarly Identity with ORCID. I have 2023 there because there have been a couple of updates, so I will definitely mention those. Okay, so we're going to take a look at why you want an ORCID ID, how to register for an ORCID, and how it integrates with other tools. If you've ever tried looking for an author online or you Google yourself, you know that names aren't unique. And even if you narrow your search to a university or a discipline, still may not be enough because occasionally researchers with the same name at the same university can share the same research interests. It's a lot easier to find a researcher if they have an ORCID. ORCID's an acronym. It stands for Open Researcher and Contributor ID. So the term ORCID ID is a little redundant, even though I say that all the time. But it's a 16-digit number that uniquely identifies the owner, sort of like having an ISBN for a person. So if you have an ORCID, you're a lot less likely to be confused with another researcher, and you'll get credit for your work. And the added bonus is that ORCIDs are completely free. This is how an ORCID indicator appears in an article by Jordi Vinhas, and here's the author's name along with the little indicator. And if you click on that, it'll show you the partial ORCID that the author chose to share with the public about his work. So this isn't his full record, but part of what he chose to share. So there are carrots and sticks for having an ORCID. A few more things about the carrots. I already mentioned that ORCIDs make it easier for you to identify and get credit for your work. ORCIDs can also simplify manuscript and grant submissions. So tools like ScienceCV integrate with your ORCID record, and that makes it easier to update your profiles across systems without having to retype that information over and over again. Now for the sticks. Funders like the NIH and the CDC have made ORCID part of their application process for research and travel awards. And many publishers like Elsevier require authors to embed their ORCID identifiers in their publication submission process. And then there is the National Security Presidential Memorandum 33. So for national security reasons, this directive requires federal funders to track researchers using persistent identifiers. And I think they're supposed to have that completely updated by 2025. Although ORCIDs aren't specified, they're really the only personal identifier that meets all of the government's PID criteria. Now, if you're a student, you may wonder why bother getting an ORCID. Actually, the best time to get an ORCID may be before you start publishing or applying for funding, because there are fewer items that you have to add manually to your initial profile. The ORCID's persistent, and it's going to follow you across institutions to track your projects, no matter where you go after you graduate. And that's going to help potential employers and collaborators find you. Although you can acquire an ORCID through the NIH, the NSF, and other grant.gov application processes, grantors are really encouraging prospective applicants to register for an ORCID before they apply for funding. So I'm going to show you the registration process, and we'll go live to orcid.org. I'm also going to stop my video. This is a really super easy process for registering your ORCID. You basically just follow the directions on the screen. I'll start by adding my first name. The last name is optional, believe it or not, but I'm going to add it Masood Paul anyway. And then I'll enter my primary email. I already have an ORCID account, but I want to show you what happens if you have an account and you have an email associated with that account. Let's get to the right field. So I am adding my Drexel ID. And before I can even confirm the ID, it says this email already exists in our system. Would you like to just sign in? Normally, if you have an ORCID record associated with a specific email, you would just sign in at this point. You might have done this some time ago and forgotten what your password is. No problem. You could just ask them to assign you a new password. But in order to show you the process, I'm going to sign up with a different email. So this one is not associated with my existing account, just so you can see how that works. Here I can add additional emails if I choose to, and I actually recommend that normally you do that. That way, if there's some problem with your email, your primary email, or let's say you go to a different university, especially if you're a student, once you graduate from Drexel, your primary email as an alum is going to be slightly different. So you want to make sure that you still have a functioning email account, regardless of whether you go to another institution. So adding an additional email will help with that. But for the purposes of demonstration here, I'm just going to click on next. So before it lets me sign up for the ORCID, it tells me, well, I don't recognize that email address, but I do recognize this name. So is this you? If I were setting up an ORCID account for real and I already had one, let's say with a different email address, I would just click on I already have an ID and it would send me back to sign in. But again, for demonstration purposes, I want to continue with this registration. So I'll just click on this link and it would ask me to create a password. So create a password following the instructions on the screen, 8 characters. You have to use a symbol or a letter and a number. And then confirm it. And let's see if I can remember what I just typed. I think that was it. Okay, it didn't flag me, so it must be the same. And then you indicate whether or not you want to receive quarterly emails from them. Actually, they don't bombard you with emails, and they're usually pretty good at sending you updates to features and tips. So I would normally check this off and then click on next. So this is where you're going to see the first discussion of visibility settings, and this is important. The visibility settings that are here are the default visibility settings for ORCID. And you'll see as we go through creating your ORCID profile that you can have different settings for different categories or entries. But this is just the sort of general umbrella visibility settings for your ORCID profile. The first one is everyone. And the information that's marked with everyone can be viewed by anyone that comes to the ORCID.org website. Since the primary reason that you're going to have an ORCID is to share your profile, you might want to consider using the everyone as a visibility setting in general. And you can see that most people do that. 87% of people who have ORCIDs choose that as their visibility setting. Trusted organization provides limited access to your ORCID record for individuals or organizations that you designate as trusted. So for example, an organization like the NSF might ask you to grant them specific permission to read your ORCID profile. Once they have the permission, the NSF can see information that you set as visible in trusted parties, in addition to any information that you set as visible to everybody. ORCID encourages you to allow trusted organizations to add and update your works on an ORCID record. They will then appear as the source of that information, and that's going to enable you and other people to feel confident that that information is authoritative and trustworthy. So I'm going to feel more I'll more likely feel that the information is valid and trustworthy if I see that, let's say, the NSF entered it as opposed to me entering it manually. You also can designate an individual as a trusted proxy or delegate. So as a student researcher or maybe a staff member, you might work with a faculty member that will designate you as their ORCID delegate or proxy. And that's going to allow you to do many things that that faculty member could do to their ORCID record, except for things like adding additional email addresses or resetting their password. And of course, you're not going to be allowed to delete their account. A designated individual also has to have their own ORCID account. And then finally, you can set it as only me, and that's going to be private. You're going to be the only person who can see that information, and trusted individuals that you've granted access to update your account can also see that information. The only time I can see using only me is, let's say you're working on your ORCID profile and you don't want to make that visible to the public or trusted organization. So you might temporarily set it as only me. Or if you're using your ORCID profile as a CV and maybe there's some older information there that you don't necessarily want to make available to the general public. Now, once you've made your settings to everyone, trusted organizations, or only me, the only thing left to do to register for this account is to consent to the privacy policy and to indicate that you are a human being by clicking on not a robot, and then go ahead and register. So I am going to, since I already have an ORCID account, I'm not going to register this one. Let's sign out here. Okay, so I'm going to log in to my ORCID account with my email address and password. You also can log in with your institutional account. I think that Drexel now has single sign-on for ORCIDs. So you can use our Drexel account for that, or you can set it up to sign in with your Google account or Facebook. And I'll show you where you can do that in a moment. But for now, I'm just going to sign in. And I am in my private account now where I can do my editing. So let me point out a couple of places and areas and how you can update those. We're going to start with your name. This is taking the name that I entered when I set up my account, but I can also include aliases. So if I tend to publish under another name, or I have maiden name information, I can click on this edit icon and add that to my ORCID account. This is the first place where I can indicate what my visibility settings are beyond just the global visibility settings that I have for my ORCID profile. So here I've added some of my other names and have indicated if I want everyone to see it or just trusted organizations. You can have ORCID generate a QR code as well. So let's say you're working on a poster or you have business cards and you want to add a QR code with your ORCID symbol on it. You can go to your account area to do that. While I'm here, I'm just going to point out a couple of other things. So let's go to account settings. This is where you can indicate how often you want to get emails from ORCID. I would recommend at least getting those, let's say, once a week if you are working on a grant or other trusted organizations. So if they're sending you updates, you'll get those frequently. You don't want to set that to never, because you won't be able to see when they're updating your account. I also recommend setting up two-factor authentication for your ORCID profile. I have that off right now because I'm teaching, but normally I have this turned on. The alternate sign-in account section is where you can find out how you can set up your ORCID profile so that you can use Drexel single sign-on, or you can use Facebook. So if you want to put an ORCID indicator on your website, this is where you would find that information. Here's the widget information for setting up the icon. Here's what the icon would look like. This is very similar to what we saw when we were looking at the article from the author. And then finally, this is where ORCID will generate a QR code for you. Just click on download your QR code and you can paste it on your poster or your business cards or wherever you need to post it. Okay, so let me go out of edit mode now, excuse me, out of my account settings and back into edit mode. You can add ORCID information to your social media accounts, which I strongly recommend. You could add it to LinkedIn, Facebook, and other accounts. You just add the name of the account and the URL for that. If you want to see what your account looks like to the public, there is a preview public record here. By default, ORCID typically will show your name and the ORCID number. But again, you may have set your information so that everyone can view it and not realize what that would look like to the public. So if I click on this preview public record, this shows me everything that the public will see from my account. And there are a few things that I've hidden, such as some of my education background. A lot of my employment background isn't necessary for everyone to be able to see, so I have that set for trusted organizations and so on. But it's a good thing to check this every now and then, especially when you're adding information, so you can see what the public is seeing. Under biography, you want to provide a brief description of your career and your interests. By the way, there are two main areas that are needed for NIH, NSF, and other major federal grants, and that's the biography information as well as the keywords. So you don't want to skip those if you're going to be applying for grants from those areas. I forgot to mention this other ID section as well. Some of you may have other personal identifiers. The researcher ID is one that's used by Clarivate to uniquely identify you. And there are others as well. Scopus IDs are common. A lot of the ones that they list here, though, are identifiers that are used in other countries. But you might want to check this section to see if you want to add any other personal identifiers to your ORCID record. So a lot of the rest of these different categories are very easy to use and intuitive. If I wanted to add employment information or additional education and qualification information here, I would just click on this plus sign. And as soon as I start typing, let's say I'm working for Yale now, or previously worked for Yale, as soon as I start typing, it's going to give me examples or make recommendations. And I suggest that you use these drop downs if they're a good match, because they make it a lot less likely that you're going to mistype something. It's going to improve the accuracy of your record. And then you would just indicate the additional details, choose a visibility setting, and save your changes. So employment and education basically work the same way. There are two different settings here, one for adding education, the other for adding qualifications. In the invited position and distinction section, you would use invited position for an invited but non-employment affiliation. So those include formal acknowledgments of your academic effort through honorary titles or invited positions. They could be paid or unpaid. Things like guest researcher, visiting lecturer, honorary fellow, or maybe emeritus professor. And then distinctions are honorary and other awards or prizes from an organization in recognition of academic or other achievements. Process for adding them is manual and works pretty much the same way as your employment and education information. You want to choose the membership section when you're a member of a society or an association, whether it's a paid membership or not. I'll click on Add here. Service is for significant donations of your time or your money or other resources to an organization or a community. And these can also include voluntary work. So I highly recommend that students take advantage of this membership and service category. Let's go down to funding. If you have grants from a major funder, there are a number of ways you can get this information into the funding section. So I'll click on Add here. There's something called the Dimensions Wizard. Click on Search and Link. And here's the Dimensions Wizard. It really is designed for major funders. So I just clicked on that link. And you can search for that information by name. Usually it's going to be under a PI or co-PI. Or you can search for it by grant title. So let's choose that. I'm going to look for a grant for COVID-19, specifically COVID-19 respiratory repercussions of long COVID. I'll click on Find by Title, and here's my grant. So I can select this, click on Next, and submit it to ORCID. ORCID does a little bit of research, and if that's a grant associated with me, it'll add it to my ORCID record. But again, these are for pretty large grants. If you're not quite sure whether or not it's likely to be in the Dimension Wizard, you can look for it. So there's a little link here that says, see which grant sources are covered by us. I'll click on that. This will tell you all the different funders that are part of the Dimension database, the country, and the time frame. If you submitted a grant, let's say with the Alzheimer's associations that fell within that time frame, but for whatever reason it wasn't coming up, I recommend you contact them. There's an email address here for contacting the people who manage that wizard. Similarly, if you have a large grant, but it's not, your funder isn't listed here, you can always contact them for that as well, but I don't know how long they actually take to add information. So I would recommend that you manually add that. I'm going to go back to my ORCID record and see where it says add here. I could just click on add manually and then indicate the kind of award or grant that I had, was awarded, and all the other information about it, and then click on Save Changes to manually add it to my record. The last thing I wanted to talk about was works. And that includes a wide range of contributions. It goes beyond just books or articles. You can use it to add posters, conference proceedings, books, patents, and so on. And again, you have a number of options for adding information, including unique identifiers. So if we go to add here, here are some of the different identifiers you could use. If you had a DOI for your article, you could just search for that. They also accept PubMed identifiers. BibTeX is really helpful because you can use it to import files, and they actually specify here, yes, so .bib files, including files exported from Google Scholar. If you have a Google Scholar profile, for example, you have a bibliography, you can download that file into a .bib file and then import it into ORCID, so you don't have to do all that typing. And then there are several other types of identifiers that you can use too. I think they accept archive, URLs, and so forth. You can have use several options for wizards, and that's under the search and link category. So when I click on that, you can see all the different wizards that you can use. Scopus is pretty common. So if you have a Scopus profile, you can use that to import records. Another one that is commonly used and has even more records than Scopus is the Crossref metadata search. Crossref, if you're not familiar with it, is an official DOI registration agency, and it's huge. So you can look up your information by author, title, DOI, and there are other options. Just going to click on this so you can see how that would work. So by default, it found my name, and it's going to look things up by my name. But instead, I'm going to look it up by an article title. If you have a DOI, that would be a lot more precise. But I'm looking up an article title called Light Scattering Properties of Surface Textured Substrates. I hit enter, and you can see here that it's searching for that title, and it's looking at millions of records. But here's the article here. If this were my article, I would click on Add to ORCID. Crossref would send me an email or a message to my ORCID account saying, you want to add this to Crossref. Are you sure this is the one that you want to add? And if I indicated yes, it would also ask me if they can be used as a trusted organization. So if I said yes, they support auto updates, and the next time they receive a publication with my ORCID ID, they'll send a message to my inbox asking for permission to update the ORCID. And they'll add any reference that they get in Crossref to my ORCID profile. Now, if I have other trusted organizations, they might also be adding records to my ORCID profile. And sometimes they are records for the same reference. So how do I keep that from being a problem? Well, it really depends on whether or not those references have some type of persistent identifier. So I'm going to go back to the back to my PowerPoint. Let me show you an example of that. So here's a case where my article has been entered by multiple trusted organizations. In this case, 3. but it has a persistent identifier. It has a DOI. So even though multiple organizations have added this record, as long as they have a DOI, they're going to recognize that as a match. And they're only going to show one of those records in my ORCID profile. Okay, the other ones will be visible to me, but the public would only see the one that I selected as preferred, which in this case was Scopus. However, there was also another entry that didn't have a DOI. So it couldn't tell whether or not this was unique or not. So it also added this to my ORCID profile, which is why it's a good idea if you're setting up trusted organizations and you're allowing them to add records to your ORCID account, check your ORCID account every now and then to keep things neat and tidy. So this is one that I might either want to hide or delete because there's no point in having the same record showing in my ORCID. If I just wanted to hide it, I could click on this Make Private, so only I would see it. If I wanted to delete it, I could delete it using this icon here, this little trash can. So hopefully that was a clear explanation. I'm just going to wrap things up here. So we briefly discussed the benefits of ORCID and how to register for an ORCID. I'll wrap things up by reminding you how to make that ORCID profile work for you. Remember, you can import ORCID records to tools like ScienceCV to create your NIH, NSF, or biosketches, and that's going to reduce the need to retype information for each grant application. You can add your ORCID ID to LinkedIn and professional sites, resumes, and CVs so potential collaborators can learn about your scholarly contributions. And although this session is really mostly about you and your ORCID, remember you can use potential collaborators or mentors' ORCIDs to learn more about them. So for example, you can search with someone's ORCID in the ORCID registry to find information about their research interests and experience via the ORCID registry, but also in databases like Scopus, Insights, or Pivot. And then you can decide if they would be a good contact, collaborator, or mentor. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact our librarians, or you can contact me, Janice Masood-Paul, at jhm52@drexel.edu. And I also encourage you to take a look at our ORCID library guide and the ORCID website, which you can find at the address on this screen. I'll make sure that this slide deck is available to you on our library website. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janice, and thank you so much to all of our viewers. Have a wonderful day.